Thank you, Mark. Your Excellencies, friends of Norfund, all Norfund employees are in the audience. But last but not least, our co-investors and sponsors and partners out there. It's a true pleasure to have you here. It's an honor for me to be able to speak to you after and celebrating these 20 years. I myself have been with Norfund for 11 years, and I can tell you it's been a fantastic journey. And there's more to come. In fact, when you listen to my speech after the two ministers, I mean, some of you will think this is much like a conspiracy. The message is very much the same. We haven't coordinated, but mindset is very much the same. What I would like to do is draw your attention to how Norfund came into being, explain some of the issues that we're struggling with in our markets at the present, explain what we do and how we do it, and then at the end, perhaps give you my visions or my hope for Norfund for the next, let's say, 10 years. But the part about history are called the new kid on the block. The new kid on the block is the new kid on the development policy area. We were basically born out of a government commission that delivered a report in 1995, asked to advise on Norway's North-South policy. And one of the proposals was actually to establish Norfund. And my reading from the report was much about drawing on Norwegian history and Norwegian experience. In 1852, Norway established Kongeriket Norges Hypotekbank, a bank to provide loans to farmers and others, to equity. Actually, my grandfather in 1862 did receive a loan of 5,000 crown, bought his farm. The farm is still in the family. In 1919, we established a bank for the fisheries to help modernize, upgrade fisheries, to take down the terrible toll in terms of debts that we had in the fishing sector. 36 in bank for the manufacturing industry, and lastly, in 65, a bank for agriculture. And as you could see, there was nothing on the other side. That was Norwegian history. The lessons learned that was encapsulated in the report from 95 was basically we need something similar for developing in the developing area. We need Norfund. This is what Norfund is doing in developing countries today. So that was basically the background for the proposal. So we were the new kid on the block, but Norway, on the other hand, was a latecomer to the development finance world. Of course, the early starter, the first one was CDC English. We have Diana Noble, former CEO of CDC in the audience. She'll speak to you at the end of the conference. The Germans and all the Nordics before us, the Finns, the Danes and the Swedes, and eventually Norway. Though it's also important to say other countries are following suit, and actually the rumors are these days that Canada is setting up its own development finance institution. A little bit about numbers, because this is the European EDFIS portfolio, and it's tripled over the decade from 2006 to 16. It's growing quite rapidly. It's not only Norfund. It will keep growing. I mean, the expectation is that probably in between 5 and 10 years, investment from development for DFIs will be bigger than ODA altogether. So we're becoming more and more significant, in particular in poor parts of the world. A little bit more about the Norfund story. We were set up in 97, 50 million NOK was the starting capital. And we've been growing ever since by 20% or more than 20% a year. And in many ways, it's been a success story. And I think it's important to draw your attention to some of the success factors. We were set up according to a separate law, the Norfund Act. The Norfund Act is very precise and clear in terms of government. Where politics ends, where decision-making and our commercial decision starts, the role of the owner, the board, and management. So together with the governance tradition that we have in Norway, in the way government owns company and how that's conducted, the true part of it has proven to be an important success factor for Norfund, and also allowed us to be a stable and predictable equity partner for a lot of, some of you here in the audience are part of co-investors and partners. Secondly, we've been supported by all governments over these 20 years. We have annual capital allocation every year, increasing, in particular in the last 4 years, by 25%. But we've been supported by all governments, despite parties in government. And as our Minister, Børge Brende, alluded to before in his white paper presented to the Parliament this spring, one of the proposals was to increase our capital allocation by 50% during the next election period. And again, it was debated in the Parliament in June, and all parties in the Parliament actually supported it. So I think the fact that we have this broad political support is also a precondition for us going forward to be successful. But it also illustrated, I think, the new development agenda that in many ways was born out of the UN meeting in Addis a few years back and launched the slogan "Billions to Trillions." The fact that, I mean, the understanding, broadly speaking in Norway, that in poor countries, in developing countries today, as in Norway in the past, there's no other way than what we would call a næringsutvikling. You need to create a profitable business, you need to create a private sector that can grow. Grant-based aid is okay, it is needed, but we have to go beyond. And the reason is what we can do is provide jobs, help local businesses grow, help them pay taxes to government, so governments are less aid-dependent and more dependent on their own taxpayers, and build skills and entrepreneurship. The next section in what I'm about to say is about what I call the bumpy road, and explain a bit about the challenges that we see in our market at the present. But first, let's remind us about history. That was also mentioned before. We had a fantastic history of reduction in poverty, absolute poor, and an increasing GDP growth in the developing world, starting in the early 90s and going on the way to the financial crisis. Though after the financial crisis, unfortunately, growth has been tapering off. Though still happily, poverty is still going down. The challenge is, in my mind, going forward, that will not continue unless we're able to take growth back up again. The golden age from the early 90s and to the financial crisis, and even beyond that in terms of poverty, is probably the best period in mankind ever. And why is that? Well, I mean, the very simple story is that it started with the end of the Cold War. So we didn't have the developed world on West and East instigated wars in a number of poor countries anymore, particularly in Africa. And after the Cold War, that allowed for political stability, and fundamental precondition for investment and economic growth, and increasing democracy, I mean, in large part of the developing world, which again allowed for foreign direct investment to start to flow to places where it didn't flow, and then creating growth. And then, so what is that? Well, I mean, as one illustration, for more than 2 decades, the number of absolute poor was reduced by 130,000 every day. Child mortality had been halved over this period, and school enrollment past 90%. So gigantic steps forward in terms of improvement for large masses of the poor. Though the last decade after the financial crisis, lower growth and less political stability, and these graphs basically show what's going on in our portfolio. First, in terms of political stability, weighted in terms of where do we put our money in our countries. And basically what it says is that more than 60% of our portfolio is in countries where the political stability has been deteriorating. The story from Ghana was also about public debt. After the financial crisis, for the first time in history, a number of countries, even in Africa, were able to pursue Keynesian policy, expansionary government budget to compensate for private sector growth. It never happened before. That's history. That's not the case anymore. Today, we see significant debt problems in a number of countries. Which comes back to our portfolio, partly in the energy sector, because we produce and sell electricity on long-term contracts to be paid for largely by government utilities, guaranteed by government, and the government simply don't have the money, and the hard currency is not there. So you see arrays building up, which of course, again, creates a lot of problems to close new projects. So that's why you see the number of new energy projects been declining over the last couple of years. And we see in financial institutions and banks, we see a bank crisis in some of our countries. We haven't really seen it in our portfolio, but we see that banks are struggling in a number of countries. So increasing debt, government debt and foreign debt is an issue that we need to understand. Though on a positive note, and again, Ghana illustrates the whole thing. This is the World Bank's ease of doing business study. Again, weighted against where is it that we put our money. More than 50% of our investments are in countries where the ease of doing money or doing business is improving. Exactly because there are politicians like Kjell Roland here today in a number of countries that fully understand the importance of the private sector, that you need to be adequate for the outside world, for the financial market. You need to attract capital and technology and skills to be successful. And for that reason, the framework conditions are slowly going in the right direction in more than 50% of our portfolio. In the development debate, the issue of inclusive growth has been more and more prominent, and it is important. It's important largely for countries themselves to build institutions, to set up a tax system, do whatever it is to create conditions for a more inclusive growth. From the outside world, what is it that we can do? To me, there's only one dominant thing: jobs, 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 and that's what Norfund and that's what the other DFIs are doing, creating jobs. Asking people in poor countries, 70% say that nothing is more important to escape poverty. Actually, to be true with you, I believe the other 30% are wrong. In Africa, only 28% of the workforce are in stable wage-paying jobs. That's a number that we need to take up. Remember, in Norwegian history, throughout the last century, what in Norwegian is called arbeidslinja, that providing jobs and keeping down unemployment is number one, and it's been that for a century across the spectrum of politics, and still today. And of course, that's also the case, and even more in developing countries. So we need to increase that number, and we need to, again, illustrating the population growth, 122 million new people into the labor force in Africa during the present decade. There's only one way, that outside world could help this country grow and can address the issue of inclusive growth. It's what we do. Closing this bumpy road, I mean, the message is basically our markets are more difficult than we saw in the early 2000s. We see lower growth. We need to take that up again. We see in some places less inclusive growth. Hard for us to do more than help them creating jobs. We see more conflict-affected countries. We need to be better, and we, the Norfund and the DFIs, in finding ways to invest in conflict-affected countries, addressing youth unemployment, and we see growing impact of climate change. Then lastly, one of the big paradoxes that we see in our world is the fact that Western financial markets seems to decouple from the poor parts of the world. We see Western banks pulling out of Africa. We see FDI, foreign direct investment, is going down over the last few years, in particular for the poorest part of the world. This we need to change. However, I mean, on a more positive note, and looking at the changing landscape that we also see out there, we see far more South-South trade. South-South trade was up by 85% since 2006. Only China's trade with Africa increased from 20 to 200 billion US dollar over a 15-year period. Very important for the growth, the very positive growth in Africa over the last 15, 20 years. And we see banks, South banks lending to other regions in the South. We see increasing regional trade. We discussed that over dinner last night. Even in Africa, you see countries starting to trade more with each other. History is that all trade went to Europe, and even bottled water came out of France at the five-star hotels where all the diplomats went in the past. That's not the case anymore. And we even invested in bottled water companies able to supply more than one country. So increasing regional trade is happening from a very low level. There's a long way to go. There's a lot of mistrust that needs to be addressed, and a lot of red tape at the borders, but it's moving in the right direction. And we see new donors with new ideas, and I think that's good for many reasons, but first of all because it allows governments in the South to decide them by themselves. They can choose between their partners. There's not one size that fits all coming out of Washington. And lastly, but not least, we also see local saving, local pension fund starting to invest in their own country, not only in government bonds, but in private equity and in infrastructure. We have a small fund called Fanisi in East Africa, closing its second fund now. For the first time, actually for the first time in Kenya, they've been able to convince 4 local pension funds to invest with them. And I think this is also something that we need to see more regional trade and more mobilizing private saving with DFI money and also private investment going forward. Then more about Norfund. What is it that we do? The slogan that we're sort of using at the present is that we are an active strategic minority investor. Before explaining what that is, let me explain what is it that we would like to do. What we aim to do is basically to build to scale, to build modern enterprises that are sustainable, are profitable, pay taxes, but most of all, create jobs. Perhaps the best, one of the good illustrations of this is a story you will learn more about later today. The investment company called Arise, helping banks in Africa grow, including Cal Bank in Ghana. Scale. I mean, it's not that small is beautiful. Small is beautiful only if it's a start of something that grows to scale. We need to create large numbers of jobs. But on the other hand, we need to be more innovative and moving into fragile states and find ways to help people help themselves, create small businesses that can grow, get out of whatever history they have, and get the economy growing from scratch. So we need to push the borders in both directions. Then the strategy, the active strategic minority. Let's start with the active. We invest directly. We serve on the boards. This morning I had a seminar with 20 of our board members serving on our board, not Norfund people, but people from different continents serving on investees that we invested in. We are selecting, we are looking for people who really understand the particular business, understand the culture, understand what this company is up to. So we serve on the boards, we work with management, and we build these platform companies or industrial-based portfolio companies, particularly in the energy sector. And 85% of what we do is equity. So that's the active part of it. The strategic is much about building knowledge. First of all, to be an active direct investor, you need to understand the place where you're investing. You need to understand the country, you need to understand the culture. So for that reason, we have these local offices, and with a couple of exceptions, we recruit locally. We need people like Inanna from now heading the Ghana office. From Ghana, we need to understand Ghana. We need to understand the language. We need to understand how to operate on the ground. So, and also for that reason, the number of countries are fairly concentrated. We're now moving slowly and carefully into West Africa, but we need to understand how to move on the ground. And we need to understand the sectors where we invest. And we invest in clean energy, in financial institutions, in the food and agri-business value chain. That's only in Africa, by the way, and in SME funds. And why do we do that? We build knowledge in sector and country because we're convinced that's the best way to maximize development. If we're successful in these sectors, that is development. Minority. I mean, we never take majority. We are a minority investor. Never beyond 50%, or most of the time below 35%. Then we need partners. So very much of what we do is about choosing and the right partners and working with them. Make sure we understand them. Make sure they understand us. Make sure we are aligned and would like to do the same thing. Again, this is a selection of some of our partners. You see some of the other DFIs are on the table. CDC again, in many ways longest standing partner. KLP, the next one, the biggest private pension fund in Norway, the only hero in our mind, only one who's been willing to go with us to invest in banks and energy in Africa, in Central America, and other places. So partners is essential for what we're doing. Then a little bit more, so where is it that our money hits the ground? How can we prove to Norwegian stakeholders and taxpayers that we're doing what we're asked to do? This is the FDI flow, private sector flow to across the world. Of course, the high income is OECD. Upper middle class is about the BRICS and much about China. And coming into the poorer parts of the world, you don't see much FDI at all. And unfortunately, it's declining at the present. So where is it that we deploy our money? Exactly the opposite. And that's what we're asked to do. Or comparing to some of the other DFI or DFIs, we have a KPI, a key performance indicator. At least a third of what we do should be in LDCs. And this compared to the average for EDFI in Europe, the EDFIs are quite different. And IFC, infrastructure, we invest 50% of what we do in clean energy. Others do more other infrastructure too. We have a KPI to do at least 50% in sub-Saharan Africa. And the KPI is 70%. We do 85% in terms of equity. We believe this is a story that we should tell to explain to our stakeholders and taxpayers in Norway. We're doing what we're asked to do. This one you saw at the beginning. This is really, the government provides the capital. The team delivers. These are the numbers. I think they speak for themselves, and they were shown at the film at the beginning, so I'll skip them and then spend a few minutes at the end and so looking forward for the next year. What would be my vision for Norfund? Well, first of all, this is the team. We are more than 70 people, photographed from yesterday, so this is actually the present team. 40% are women. We have people from 17 different countries. People with deep skills in investment, in maintaining, building partnership, what we're doing. I'm convinced that we are well positioned for the next steps. We are able to keep growing and we can take it to the next level. My hope would be that the Parliament, Stortinget, is following up on the white paper from Børge Brende and increase our annual capital allocation by 50% over the next 4 years. If we're able to maintain the present close to 10% return on capital, this is what will happen over the next 10 years. We'll take it from 20 to $100 billion. What does that mean? We can do 5 times more of what we're doing today. We can be even more additional. The other dimension, of course, is the catalytic role, and this is where the paradox comes in. This illustration basically tries to portray what we see today, that financial institutions and investors in our part of the world today really struggle to understand how they can start to invest in poor parts of the world. We've had a big discussion in Norway over the mandate for our pension fund, or sovereign wealth fund, the big one. And the proposal for many is that they should move into unlisted stocks and more infrastructure. And that probably a good idea, but I think it's important for people to understand what that would entail is more infrastructure and unlisted stocks in OECD. We're not talking about moving to our part of the world. My vision is that 10 years from now, we will be able to mature part of our portfolio. And think about Arise that you will learn later. 10 years from now, Arise and some of the platform companies that we have in energy, they will be mature enough for pension funds or institutional money to come in and buy us out so we can take our money and go to the next step. It's a long way, we're not there, but we need to turn the tide, to turn the decoupling of Western financial markets where interest rates are 0 or negative. We need to find ways to move this money together with DFI money, and that's an important part of what the DFIs are all about. We need to build that, to bridge that gap. So that's my, actually that's my hope for the next 10 years. We were able to keep growing, take it to 100 billion fund, then we can do far more of what we're doing today. We could, and in particular in terms of jobs, and that we'll be able to connect, to build, to bridge the gap with private, the big private money. Thank you.